The alley stank of rot and neglect. The air was thick with the scent of garbage, damp cardboard, and something worse, something dying. A dog lay in the shadows, his body curled tight, ribs jutting out like sharp blades beneath his thin, dirty fur. His breath was shallow, his eyes half closed. He had stopped fighting days ago. There was no point. No one came. No one cared. A rat scurried near, sniffing at his unmoving paw. Even the rat knew. This creature was at the edge of death, teetering on the line between this world and whatever lay beyond. Footsteps. Soft. Careful. Hesitant. He barely reacted. People walked by this alley all the time. Sometimes they glanced his way. Most didn't. It didn't matter anymore. But this time, the footsteps stopped. A shadow blocked the dim glow of the street lamp. A voice, gentle, uncertain, broke the silence. "Oh my God," warmth pressed against his side. Fingers traced over his ribs, his filthy fur. He felt something strange in that touch. Not pity. Not disgust. Something else. Determination. The woman crouched beside him, her breathing unsteady. "You're still alive," she whispered, almost to herself. But barely. A deep part of him knew he should be afraid. Humans had never been kind. But he had no strength left to run. No will left to care. She reached into her bag, pulling out a bottle of water. Twisting the cap off, she poured a small stream into her palm and lifted it to his mouth. The scent of it, clean, fresh, made his dry tongue twitch. "Come on," she coaxed. "Just a little." He hesitated, then weakly licked at the water. It was the first taste of kindness he had known in longer than he could remember. Her hand moved to his side, feeling the bones beneath his skin. "You don't have much time," she murmured. "I have to get you out of here." She looked over her shoulder, checking the empty street. Then, without hesitation, she slid her arms beneath his frail body and lifted him. The weight of him made her stagger, but she didn't let go. His head lolled against her chest, his breath a weak whisper against her coat. She shouldn't have found him. She shouldn't have stopped. But she did. And as she carried him into the night, something shifted. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, his dull, lifeless eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, something unexplainable happened. A strange pulse, like a faint electric current, rushed through her arms, spreading through her chest. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was something else. A connection. An understanding. Like the flicker of something forgotten, something buried. The dog didn't move, didn't react. But his eyes didn't leave hers. And deep inside him, something stirred. Something that was never meant to wake. The connection that had been there earlier pulsed faintly again, though she still couldn't understand it. She tried to push aside her growing unease. She had to focus on keeping him alive. As the night wore on, she tended to the dog's wounds, wrapping him in fresh bandages, and preparing a warm bed for him to rest. His breathing steadied, but the uneasiness in her chest remained. Something wasn't right. By morning, she was exhausted, barely able to keep her eyes open. But when she looked at the dog again, she was surprised to see that he was breathing easier, his coat was shinier, his body seemed to have regained some strength. It was as if he had healed overnight. The woman sat back, her hand hovering near his body. There was no way he could have healed that fast. It didn't make sense. His injuries had been serious, too serious for a simple night's rest. Yet, here he was, breathing as though nothing had happened. Her mind raced. She couldn't help it. How was this possible? But before she could think too much on it, the dog opened his eyes. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head to look at her. His gaze was intense, almost as if he were studying her, searching for something. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, were now sharp. Clear. Intelligent. She froze. This wasn't just some random stray. This wasn't a typical rescue. The dog stood, his legs shaky at first, but stronger than she had expected. He moved toward her with an eerie grace, his head tilting slightly to the side as if understanding her every movement. She hesitated, but then instinctively reached out to him. When her fingers brushed against his fur, she felt it again, the pulse, the strange, unfamiliar connection. And this time, the dog didn't look away. He locked his gaze with hers. Something in the air shifted. She didn't know why, but she was certain of one thing now: this dog was no ordinary animal. She had saved him from death, but the truth was, she wasn't sure who had saved who. The woman didn't stop running, even when her legs ached, and the weight of the dog seemed to grow heavier with each step. She couldn't explain it, but there was something urgent in the air, something she couldn't ignore. She had to keep going. She had to save him. When she finally made it to her car, she carefully placed the dog in the back seat, securing him with a blanket she found in the trunk. Her hands trembled, but she didn't let herself falter. The streets were empty. The cold night stretched out before her, but her focus never wavered. She drove quickly, not knowing exactly where she was headed but trusting an instinct she couldn't explain. It was only after she pulled up to her small apartment that she allowed herself to take a deep breath. The dog was still unconscious in the back seat, his fur matted with dirt and blood. She knew he was weak, too weak, but she couldn't leave him in the alley. She had to try. When she opened the door to her apartment, she hurried inside, setting the dog gently onto the couch. His breathing was shallow, his body twitching in his sleep, but he was alive. She began to clean him as best she could, carefully washing his wounds with warm water, her fingers brushing the scars that marked his once beautiful coat. She didn't think much of it at first, but the more she cleaned him, the more she noticed something strange. There was a mark on his back. It wasn't a wound, no, it was something else. Something that had been deliberately placed there, hidden beneath layers of grime and fur. A symbol. Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned in closer, running her fingers over the raised edges of the mark. It didn't look like any animal brand she had ever seen. The lines were too straight, too precise, almost mechanical. It didn't look natural. The dog stirred, and for a moment, she thought he was waking up. But he didn't. His body seemed to react to the touch of her hands, a shudder running through him, as if something deep inside him recognized her presence. The woman couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The dog's strange healing, the intense connection, and those eyes that seemed to pierce through her, they all made her feel uneasy, as though she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't yet see. Something was coming. She tried to convince herself she was just imagining things. After all, she had rescued an abused animal, and surely, this kind of bond between them was just a result of that. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that this was different. The dog spent most of the next few days recovering, but every time she looked at him, something inside her stirred. He no longer looked like the broken animal she had found in the alley. His eyes were bright, his movements fluid, and his posture proud. But it wasn't just that. There was an awareness in him, something that shouldn't be there in an animal that had barely survived. She tried to keep busy, taking him for walks around the quiet neighborhood, watching as he moved with unusual precision. The way he avoided obstacles, the way he seemed to sense things before they happened, it was impossible to ignore. One evening, as they were walking back to her apartment, the dog suddenly stopped, his body rigid, eyes fixed on something ahead. She looked in the direction he was staring, but saw nothing. The street was empty, save for a few cars passing by. But then, just as quickly, she saw it, a dark vehicle parked at the end of the block, its headlights off. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that car. She had seen it parked near her building earlier that week, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, the feeling in her gut couldn't be ignored. The dog growled low, his stance shifting. His ears were alert, and his eyes narrowed, as though the car was some kind of threat. The woman's mind raced. She tried to dismiss the fear rising in her chest, but it was impossible. What was going on? "Easy, boy," she whispered, hoping to calm him. But the dog wasn't listening. His focus was locked on the vehicle, his body tense, ready to act. She pulled gently on his leash, trying to coax him back to the apartment, but he wouldn't move. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at the car. That gut feeling, the one that told her something was terribly wrong, pulsed again. She quickly turned and started walking briskly in the opposite direction, keeping her head down, hoping the car hadn't noticed them. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The air felt charged, as though something was about to happen. Suddenly, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. A group of men, 2 or 3, she couldn't tell, were walking toward them, their pace quick, purposeful. The dog's growl grew louder, more urgent. He wasn't backing down. "Stay close," she whispered, gripping the leash tighter, but she knew the dog wasn't the only one on alert. She could feel it too. Something was closing in. The men were getting closer now. She could hear their footsteps echoing down the quiet street, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. There was something about their stride, confident, deliberate, that made her stomach churn. She quickened her pace, but the men matched her step. The dog lunged forward, his muscles rippling as he strained against the leash, a ferocious snarl escaping from his throat. She pulled him back, her breath shallow as panic surged through her. Stay calm," she whispered to herself. The dog wasn't listening. The moment the men were within arm's reach, he barked loudly, his teeth bared, and the men froze. There was a split second of silence, as if the world held its breath. Then one of the men spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "Move along, lady. There's nothing for you here." But she could see it in their eyes, something was off. These weren't just ordinary people. They weren't even trying to hide their intent. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as the men slowly advanced, their gaze never leaving her or the dog. She knew something was coming. Before she could react, the dog growled again, this time low and threatening, and one of the men flinched. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the men turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The woman stood frozen, heart racing, watching the dark figures fade into the night. The dog didn't relax. He continued to growl, his eyes watching the shadows where the men had disappeared, still tense, still alert. She breathed deeply, trying to calm the panic that still churned in her stomach. She didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure, the dog was a warning. He wasn't just a stray. He wasn't just a rescue. He was something far more dangerous. The woman couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on her. The men who had followed her, the car parked down the street, and the dog's strange, protective behavior, it was all beginning to feel like a tangled web she couldn't escape. She had no answers, only questions, and the more she dug, the deeper the hole seemed to get. For the next few days, she tried to keep things as normal as possible. The dog, who was still unnamed, rested by her side, his healing process continuing at an unnaturally fast pace. Each morning, he appeared stronger, more vibrant, and with every passing hour, she grew more convinced that he was hiding something. Something not just about his past but about his very existence. It was the late afternoon when the unsettling thought first crossed her mind, she needed to know more. She had to understand who, or what, this dog really was. If she could uncover his secrets, maybe she could understand the strange events that had started to unfold around them. So, with no clear plan, she took the dog to a vet. She had avoided doing so earlier, unsure if anyone would ask too many questions, but the truth was, she had no idea what was going on with him, and she didn't feel like taking any more chances. The vet was a kind, older woman, known for her gentle hands and soft smile, but when she saw the dog, her demeanor shifted immediately. There was something in her eyes, recognition, fear, even, something the woman couldn't quite place. "We'll need to run some tests," the vet said quietly, her voice almost too soft. "I'll need you to stay here while I get started." The woman agreed, but her nerves were on edge. The moment the vet left the room, she started to pace, the dog beside her, still unusually calm. She kept glancing at him, wondering if he knew more than he let on. It didn't take long for the vet to return, but when she did, she didn't seem as reassuring as before. She stood in the doorway, holding a set of X-ray images in her hand, her expression serious, unreadable. The woman's stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" The vet hesitated, stepping forward slowly and setting the images down on the counter. "I've never seen anything like this. It's almost, not possible." She gestured to the X-rays. The woman leaned in, her heart racing as she scanned the images, but she wasn't prepared for what she saw. There, just under the dog's skin, in the place where his back had been so badly scarred, was something foreign. It wasn't a wound or an infection, but an object, embedded deep within the flesh. It looked almost mechanical. No, not mechanical. Technological. The woman blinked in disbelief. "What is that?" The vet shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it doesn't belong to any animal. It's something different. It almost looks like a transmitter." "Transmitter?" The woman's voice was a whisper. "I'm sorry, I don't want to alarm you, but this isn't natural. Someone must have implanted it there. And it's not just an injury. This is a message of some sort. Or a signal." The words hit the woman like a slap to the face. She couldn't process what the vet was saying. It didn't make sense. Why would someone do this to a dog? And what about the dog? "Why does he heal so quickly?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The vet looked uneasy, glancing at the dog before speaking. "I don't know. I've never seen an animal recover like this, not from those injuries. It's as if his body is regenerating. This kind of healing is impossible." The woman's mind was racing. She thought back to the way the dog had reacted to the men outside her apartment, the way he had warned her. Had he known something she didn't? Was this technology connected to the dog's strange abilities? And if so, why hadn't she noticed it earlier? "Is there any way to find out more about this?" she asked, her voice urgent. The vet shook her head, clearly uneasy. "I'd suggest you contact someone who specializes in this kind of thing. But be careful. Whatever this is, it's not just an animal. This is a project, something engineered. I can't tell you more than that." The woman stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning with the implications. There were people, dangerous people, who were willing to do whatever it took to keep this a secret. And those men who had been following her, the ones who'd watched her from the shadows, they weren't just interested in a sick dog. They were after something much bigger. As she left the clinic with the dog by her side, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. The life she had known before, simple, quiet, isolated, was slipping away. Nothing about this was simple anymore. She was caught in something much larger than herself. And she had no choice but to follow the trail, no matter where it led. She had to find out who had done this to the dog. She had to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking her own life. But there was one thing she knew for sure, she was no longer just saving the dog. She was saving herself. The weight of the truth hit her hard. The dog, now more than just a pet or a stray she had taken in, was at the center of something dangerous. something far bigger than she could have imagined. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear, there were people who would stop at nothing to reclaim what she had taken. It wasn't long before she started noticing the signs that she wasn't alone. At night, she would catch glimpses of cars parked near her apartment, dark vehicles with tinted windows, unmoving, as though they were watching, waiting. Every time she left her apartment, she felt eyes on her. The dog, too, seemed to sense it. His body tensed, his ears perked, and he would growl at the slightest sound, even when there was nothing there. It was as if he knew, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. And in some strange way, she understood. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the dog. It was about whatever he carried inside him. She couldn't stay in the apartment much longer. She was too exposed, too vulnerable. But running, fleeing, wasn't in her nature. She had never been the type to cower in fear. The decision came quickly, she would leave, but not without answers. The moment she started packing, she realized the gravity of what she was about to do. The fear that had gripped her before was now mixed with something else, determination. The dog watched her from the couch, his eyes following her every movement. She hesitated for a moment, then bent down and rubbed his fur. "We're going to figure this out. You and me," she whispered. And so, they left. With only a small bag of essentials and the dog by her side, she headed out into the night. The first stop was a small town on the outskirts of the city, isolated, quiet. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions. She hoped it would offer some temporary refuge, a place to regroup and figure out their next move. But as they pulled into the town, she noticed the same dark vehicle she had seen earlier parked across the street, its engine running. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The men were getting closer. They knew where she was. She didn't have much time. The woman rushed into a nearby diner, hoping to blend in, but the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt the air around her change. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, old, quiet, and familiar, but something about it felt off tonight. Her gut told her that someone in here was watching her. The dog remained calm, as if he too could sense the unease. He stayed by her side, his eyes scanning the room. It was then that she saw him, a man at the back booth, his eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. She tried to ignore him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was more than just a passerby. There was something about him. He had a quiet presence, almost too calm, and yet his gaze never wavered. She ordered a coffee, trying to act casual, but she couldn't stop glancing over at the man. When he stood and moved toward her, she felt a chill run through her. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice low. "You're not from around here, are you?" Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to keep her composure. "No, just passing through." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something unsettling in his expression, something cold. "That dog you're with," he said, glancing down at the dog, who had not reacted. "It's an interesting companion." The woman's heart raced. How did he know about the dog? She tried to keep her voice steady. "He's just a dog." "I'm not sure what you mean." The man nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from her to the dog. "Oh, I'm sure you don't. But you should be careful." A shiver ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say there are people who know exactly who you're with. And they'll do whatever it takes to get him back." His words hit her like a blow. She had known there was danger, but hearing it spoken so plainly made it real. These weren't just random people. They were after the dog. He smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "It's a good thing you're on the move, then." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the night. The woman sat in stunned silence, her mind spinning. She had barely processed what he had said when she heard it, the sound of a car engine idling outside, the same dark vehicle from before. She stood up abruptly, her hands shaking as she grabbed the dog's leash and bolted for the door. This was no longer just a game of hide-and-seek. It was a chase. As she stepped into the night, the world around her felt different, darker, more dangerous. She didn't know who those men were, but she knew one thing for sure: they would not stop until they had the dog. And the more she ran, the more she realized that the dog's past was far more complicated, and far more dangerous, than she could ever have imagined. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as she darted down the street, the dog at her side, moving with a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. The dark vehicle was no longer outside the diner, but the weight of the man's words still lingered in her mind. There are people who know exactly who you're with. As she moved further away from the diner, she tried to steady her breath, to think. The dog, this dog, was at the center of it all. He wasn't just a survivor of abuse. He wasn't just a rescue. He had something inside him, something dangerous, something that made people willing to chase her, willing to risk everything to get him back. She couldn't understand it. She thought back to the vet's words, a transmitter, she had said. A signal. But it didn't make sense. Dogs didn't carry things like that inside them. This wasn't just any animal. This was a weapon. The woman's mind raced as she tried to connect the dots. The dog's strange healing, his unnatural speed in recovering from injuries, his awareness of things before they happened, he wasn't normal. There was something in his past that had been hidden, buried beneath layers of deceit and technology. And if those men were really after him, they weren't just hunting a stray. They were hunting something far more valuable. She needed answers, but where to find them? Who could she trust? As she turned onto a quieter street, she felt the familiar pulse of unease that had been with her since she first took the dog in. The sense that she was being watched, it hadn't gone away. In fact, it was only growing stronger. She could feel the shadows closing in. It was then that the dog stopped, his body stiffening, his eyes narrowing. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. He knew something was wrong. And then, from the darkness ahead, a figure stepped into view. The woman tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the dog's leash, but the dog stayed perfectly still, his focus unwavering. The figure moved closer, and the woman's heart skipped a beat. It was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket, his face hidden beneath a hood. But as he got closer, she noticed something: his movements were too deliberate, too precise. He wasn't just any stranger. This man was trained. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, even measured, as though he already knew everything there was to know about her. "I suggest you stop running." The woman's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But she knew there was nowhere to hide. The man had blocked her path, and the dog, her only hope, was standing motionless at her side, seemingly unfazed by the looming threat. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the dog. There was recognition in his eyes. "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "You don't know what you're dealing with. But I do." She took a step back, her mind racing. "What do you want with him?" The man's gaze didn't shift. "You can't keep him. You don't understand what he is, what he represents. There are forces at play here that you can't comprehend." The woman's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure whether he was threatening her, warning her, or both. But one thing was clear: this man knew. Before she could respond, the man took a step closer. "The dog isn't just a dog. He's a piece of something much bigger, something that has been hidden for years. And people like me," he said, his eyes narrowing, "we make sure that things like him don't fall into the wrong hands." A cold shiver ran down her spine. The dog wasn't just a survivor. He was part of something planned, something engineered. And people like this man, whoever he was, would stop at nothing to get him back. The woman shook her head. No. I don't care what he is. He's mine now. I'm keeping him. For the first time, the man smiled, but it was a cruel, humorless smile. You don't have a choice, he said softly. They're coming. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows as swiftly as he had appeared. The woman was left standing in the empty street, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind spinning. Who was that man? And who were these people who were chasing them? She looked down at the dog, who stood still, as if waiting for something. But what? The woman realized something. The dog was more than just a companion. He was the key. To what, she still didn't know. But whatever it was dangerous. As she stood there, with the cool night air pressing against her skin, she knew one thing: she couldn't run anymore. There was no escaping whatever was coming. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of secrets and lies. But the question remained, who was she really up against? And how far would they go to take the dog back? The woman's footsteps echoed in the still night as she walked with the dog by her side, the weight of the man's warning heavy on her mind. They're coming. What did that even mean? Who were they? And why had this dog, this animal, become so important? It didn't make sense. She couldn't just turn back now. She couldn't go back to her life before. The moment she had picked up that battered dog in the alley, her life had been forever changed. And now, she was caught in a world of secrets, lies, and dangerous forces beyond her comprehension. Her apartment was no longer an option. Staying anywhere for too long felt like a mistake. As much as she hated the idea, she had no choice but to keep moving, keep running. She couldn't trust anyone. The man's warning, that chilling smile, had made it clear, this was not just some random pursuit. The dog wasn't a stray. He was something else entirely. The woman's thoughts raced as she pulled the dog into a small, quiet cafe. It was out of the way, isolated from the bustling city streets, and in some way, it felt like the safest place. She needed time to think, to figure out her next move. But even in the relative safety of the cafe, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The dog was unusually quiet, sitting beside her, his eyes constantly darting around the room. It was then that she noticed the man sitting in the corner. He wasn't like the other customers, blending in with the crowd. He stood out, calm, composed, but somehow too observant. His eyes never left her, never left the dog. The woman's heart skipped a beat. She knew immediately. This wasn't just a coincidence. The man stood up slowly, walking toward her table with the same controlled, deliberate pace that sent a chill through her spine. Her hand instinctively went to her bag, feeling for the pepper spray she had picked up during their escape. She knew she couldn't outrun him. The only option left was to confront him. Looking for someone? She asked, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. The man smiled, a thin, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're smarter than you look. The woman narrowed her eyes. What do you want? He pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for an invitation. I've been tracking you for days now. I know what you're involved in. I know what you're protecting. The woman kept her voice calm. You're just another one of them, aren't you? The man didn't flinch. If by them you mean the people who are trying to keep things from getting out of control, then yes. I'm one of them. He glanced at the dog, who sat perfectly still, staring at him with an almost unnerving intensity. We've been watching you, the man continued, his voice low. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. The dog, it's not just a pet. It's a tool. A weapon. The woman felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she held her ground. "I don't care what it is. He's my responsibility now." The man's expression hardened. "You think you have a choice? You don't. There are things happening, forces that you've never even heard of. And those people, the ones you've been running from, they're not the ones you need to worry about. What's coming is much worse." His words hit her like a blow. What was worse than the people who had already been chasing her? Before she could respond, the man's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You can't outrun this. The dog, he's not just a product of science. He's part of something bigger. A program that goes back decades. You're not dealing with a rogue experiment. You're dealing with something designed to change the world." The weight of his words settled into her stomach, a cold, tight feeling of fear and uncertainty. But she refused to let it show. "What's your point?" she asked, her voice quiet, but firm. "My point is this: you don't know who you're up against. You think those men are dangerous? They're nothing compared to who's really pulling the strings." The man leaned in closer, his eyes locked on hers, his voice barely audible now. "You think they're after the dog? No. They're after the signal inside him. The transmission. And once they have it, they'll control everything." She shook her head, her mind a swirl of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" The man's gaze softened, as though he could see the doubt in her eyes. "There's something embedded in the dog's system. A piece of technology, more advanced than anything you've ever seen. And those who want it? They'll stop at nothing to get it." The woman's thoughts raced. She thought back to the strange mark she had found on the dog's back, the way his healing seemed impossible, the way the men had been following them. They weren't chasing a stray. They were after something powerful. She stood up, her decision clear now. "I don't care what they want. I'm not letting anyone take him." The man's eyes grew darker, and he stood as well. "You think you have a choice, but you don't. People like you and me don't get to make choices in this. You're a pawn, just like the rest of us. And sooner or later, you'll realize that running doesn't solve anything." Before she could say anything else, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with more questions than answers. She watched him leave, the weight of his warning hanging over her. The dog, still sitting calmly beside her, looked up at her with those unnerving, intelligent eyes, as though he understood everything the man had said. The woman didn't know where to go from here. But one thing was certain: whatever was coming, it was bigger than just a chase. It was bigger than her. And it was only a matter of time before the world would change forever. The woman could feel the weight of the man's words pressing on her chest. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. Every step she took was one closer to something she didn't fully understand. She had always thought that by rescuing the dog, by giving him a chance to live, she could change his life. But now, she realized she wasn't just changing his life, she was caught in the web of a much larger plan. There were forces at play here, dark forces that wanted control over the dog. Control over the signal embedded in his body. Whatever this transmission was, it was more important than she could fathom. And the more she tried to run from it, the more she realized she couldn't. The enemy was closing in. She spent the next few days in constant motion. Moving from place to place, staying only long enough to regroup, but always looking over her shoulder. Every shadow felt like it hid someone, and every turn held a new danger. The people who had been after her were relentless, always just one step behind. But no matter how fast she moved, she couldn't escape the truth: there was nowhere left to hide. She had pushed too far into this world, a world of secrets and danger, and the only choice now was to face it. The dog, quiet and steady as ever, seemed to sense her anxiety. It was as if he knew what was coming, the final confrontation. The tension in the air was palpable. The moment of reckoning was near. One night, as the moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the desolate street, she knew it was time. She couldn't keep running. She had to face the ones who were chasing her, and the truth that had been buried for so long. She made her way to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. She had received an anonymous tip, a meeting point, a final showdown. Whether it was a trap or a chance at freedom, she didn't know, but she was out of options. This was it. As she approached the warehouse, the dog's stance shifted. He had been walking calmly beside her, but now, he was alert. His body was tense, his muscles coiled, ready. She stopped in her tracks. He knew something was coming. "Stay close," she whispered to him, but the dog didn't move. He only stared at the darkened building ahead, his eyes fixed on something, or someone, inside. The woman hesitated for a moment, her hand gripping the strap of the bag she had kept close to her side. Then, without another word, she pushed open the heavy door to the warehouse. The air inside was stale, the floor littered with dust and debris. But it was the figures in the shadows that drew her attention. They had been waiting for her. A group of men, their faces obscured by dark hoods and masks, stood in the center of the room. Their eyes were hidden, but their intent was clear. They were here for one reason, the dog. The woman felt a surge of adrenaline. She knew this was her moment. The dog had become more than just an animal to her. He had become her companion, her protector. And now, it was time to protect him. One of the men stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "We've been looking for you." The woman squared her shoulders. "You'll never take him." The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down her spine. "You don't understand. You never did. This isn't about the dog. This is about control. About the future." She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't care what you want. He's not yours to control." The dog growled, his hackles raised, his body stiff and ready. It was as though he understood her resolve, his energy matching hers. Together, they were a force that couldn't be subdued. The man didn't move. Instead, he nodded to the others. Without warning, the men lunged forward. But they didn't anticipate the dog. In a blur of motion, he was on them, his teeth bared, a ferocious growl tearing from his throat. He was faster than any human could have imagined, his body a blur of speed and strength as he took down one of the men in a single movement. The woman stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what was happening. She had seen the dog's power before, but never like this. He wasn't just reacting, he was attacking with purpose, with an intensity that suggested he had been trained for this very moment. But even as the dog incapacitated the men around him, the woman knew they were far from done. These men weren't the real threat. They were just pawns. The true power, the ones pulling the strings, were yet to reveal themselves. "Move," the woman shouted to the dog. The dog responded instantly, his movements seamless, as if he understood her words. Together, they made their way deeper into the warehouse, avoiding the remaining men as they continued to fight. And then they saw him, the one who had been behind it all. A figure stepped out from the shadows, his presence cold and imposing. The woman recognized him immediately. He was the man who had warned her in the cafe, the one who had said there was no escape. "This is where it ends," the man said, his voice quiet but full of authority. "You should have stayed out of this. Now you're too deep to turn back." The woman faced him, her body tense, her resolve stronger than ever. "I'll never let you control him. You won't win." The man smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "You already have. But you don't even know it yet." Before she could react, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, a remote, or perhaps a trigger. The woman's heart skipped a beat. What was he going to do? The dog, sensing the danger, sprang forward, but it was too late. The man pressed the button, and the warehouse seemed to shake as a low hum filled the air. The woman froze. What had he just activated? And then it happened, the transmission. The signal that had been hidden inside the dog for so long suddenly flared to life, filling the room with an overwhelming, almost otherworldly energy. The woman realized then, the dog wasn't just a weapon. He was a key. And it was only just beginning. The room seemed to tremble as the strange energy pulsed through the air. The woman's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as she felt the vibration of the signal rippling from the dog. It was unlike anything she had ever felt, a force, raw and primal, pouring out of him. Her heart raced as she watched the dog react to the energy, his eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The man, the one who had orchestrated this entire pursuit, watched with cold satisfaction, the smile never leaving his face. But she could sense the underlying fear in his eyes. Something was wrong. This wasn't going according to his plan. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief. She looked at the dog, who stood silently beside her, his energy filling the room with a silent power that seemed to threaten everything around them. The man's expression faltered for just a second. Then he stepped forward, his hand raised as if to control the situation. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us. You think you're saving him, but you're only setting the stage for a new world. A world where we control everything." Her eyes narrowed. "You were never in control. Not of him. Not of anything." The dog's growl rumbled in the depths of his chest, a low, primal sound that sent a shockwave through the room. The woman stood tall, feeling the strange bond she shared with him. The connection they had formed, the inexplicable force that had pulled her into this fight, was not something that could be controlled, no matter what these people thought. But even as she stood there, her mind racing, she felt the weight of the situation press down on her. The world had changed in an instant. She had changed. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive. The dog had shown her something. Something deep, something powerful, the strength to choose. The man advanced, his eyes focused, determined. "You still don't understand, do you? It doesn't matter how much you fight. You can't stop what's coming. The signal will reach its peak, and once it does, there's no going back. You'll see what we're capable of." The woman's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She looked at the dog, at his eyes, steady and unwavering, and she knew. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something greater than that. "You're wrong," she said, her voice firm. "You think you can control us. But you're just afraid of what we can do together. You're afraid because you know that once we embrace our power, once we choose to fight back, nothing will ever be the same." The man paused, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out what she meant. But he didn't get the chance to react. The dog, sensing the danger, stepped forward in one swift motion. Before the man could even raise his hand, the dog lunged, his body a blur of strength and speed, and in a single movement, he knocked the man to the ground. The woman stepped back, her breath catching as the dog stood over the man, his eyes glowing with that strange energy, his body still and poised, as if waiting for her command. She felt the power radiating from him, the same power that had kept her safe, that had brought her this far. The power of choice, of fighting for something that mattered. The man, now on the ground, looked up at her with disbelief, his face twisted in anger and fear. You don't know what you've unleashed." The woman shook her head. "No. What I've unleashed is freedom. What I've unleashed is the truth." The dog growled once more, the low rumble vibrating through the air, but he didn't strike. He didn't need to. The man was broken, defeated by the simple truth that he had tried so desperately to control. For a long moment, silence filled the warehouse. The only sound was the hum of the signal still pulsing through the air, its power now a force that was beyond anyone's reach. The woman took a step forward, standing tall as she looked down at the man who had tried to break her, tried to take the dog, tried to bend the world to his will. But she knew now, he was the one who had been broken all along. "You can't stop us," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore. The world is changing. And we're a part of it." She turned away from him, her eyes meeting the dog's. He was still the same as ever, steady, strong, and full of promise. She had saved him, yes. But in return, he had shown her something deeper, something that would change her life forever. The lesson was clear: no matter how dark the world seemed, no matter how impossible the fight, the power to choose was always ours. As they walked out of the warehouse together, the air felt different. The weight of the world seemed to lift, as if they had broken free from something that had held them down for far too long. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the woman felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. And with that hope, she knew that whatever came next, she and the dog would face it together. Because they had already learned the most important lesson of all: no one can take your power unless you let them.